David, you can't do this to me.
I'm sorry, it has to be this way.
3 weeks after her father's funeral, Emily barely recognized the silence inside the home she had shared with David for almost 12 years. It wasn't the peaceful silence of two people comfortable in each other's company. It was the kind of silence that settles in after something precious has already been taken away. Her father, Robert, had always been the person she called when life became confusing. He never claimed to have all the answers, but somehow every conversation with him made the world feel manageable again. Now he was gone. The funeral flowers had already begun to wilt, sympathy cards were stacked on the dining room table, and every room still carried reminders of the man who had quietly shaped her entire life. Then came another loss she never imagined. David looked across the kitchen table and calmly told her he wanted a divorce. His explanation sounded almost rehearsed. He said people changed. He said they had grown apart. He said he had found happiness with someone else. Emily searched his face, hoping to find even a trace of regret, but there was none. The man she had built a life with spoke as though he were canceling a business contract instead of ending a marriage. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To everyone outside their marriage, David and Emily had looked like the perfect American couple. Friends remembered neighborhood cookouts, anniversary dinners, holiday photographs, and vacations that filled social media with smiling faces and breathtaking landscapes. They lived in a comfortable suburban community where neighbors greeted one another by first name and children rode bicycles until sunset. David had built a successful consulting business that specialized in corporate logistics, while Emily worked in nonprofit education, helping underfunded schools secure grants for libraries and technology. Money had never seemed to be a major source of conflict because David constantly reminded everyone that his company was thriving. He drove luxury vehicles, wore expensive watches, entertained clients at exclusive restaurants, and projected the image of a man who had everything under control. Emily, on the other hand, remained remarkably grounded. She wore the same modest jewelry for years, preferred family gatherings over expensive parties, and rarely discussed finances with anyone. Even their closest friends assumed David was the financial powerhouse in the relationship. Almost nobody paid attention to Robert, Emily's quiet father, who always arrived wearing simple jackets, drove older pickup trucks, and spoke more about fishing, woodworking, and family than investments or business. If someone had suggested that Robert possessed extraordinary wealth, most people would have laughed at the idea. Robert carefully protected that impression for decades, and there was a reason for it. Across the United States, stories have surfaced over the years about extraordinarily wealthy individuals choosing remarkably ordinary lifestyles, sometimes living in modest homes while quietly accumulating fortunes through disciplined investing in private business ownership. Financial historians have documented numerous examples of self-made millionaires and billionaires who deliberately avoided displays of wealth because they believed privacy was the greatest protection money could buy. Robert shared that philosophy. Public records would eventually reveal that years earlier he had quietly purchased substantial ownership interests in regional manufacturing companies before they expanded nationwide. He invested patiently, reinvested profits instead of spending them, and refused interviews or public recognition. Those closest to him knew he disliked attention more than anything else. Even David, despite marrying Robert's only daughter, never asked detailed questions about his father-in-law's finances. He assumed the older man had enjoyed a comfortable retirement from years of steady work. That assumption would become the single most expensive mistake of his entire life. Emily remembered countless evenings when David barely acknowledged Robert during family dinners. While Robert asked thoughtful questions about everyone's lives, David spent most conversations checking emails, answering client calls, or steering discussions toward his own achievements. Robert never appeared offended. He simply smiled politely, complimented the meal, and continued treating David with quiet respect. Emily noticed these moments but convinced herself they were harmless personality differences. She believed time would strengthen the relationship between the two men. Instead, the distance only grew wider. David admired people who displayed success through visible luxury. Robert believed genuine success required no announcement. Their values could not have been more different, yet neither man openly challenged the other. Looking back years later, those dinners would take on an entirely different meaning. Robert had spent nearly a decade observing the man his daughter married. He watched how David treated waiters, employees, neighbors, strangers, and especially Emily. He listened far more than he spoke. While everyone else underestimated him, Robert was quietly collecting impressions that would ultimately shape decisions no one saw coming. If you had asked anyone in Robert's neighborhood who he was, the answers would have sounded almost identical. They would have described a polite widower who enjoyed fixing old furniture, attending church on Sundays, helping neighbors repair broken fences, and spending quiet mornings drinking coffee on his front porch. Children knew him as the man who always kept birdseed in his garage because he loved watching cardinals gather outside his kitchen window. The local hardware store employees greeted him by first name because he was there so often, usually buying paintbrushes, lumber, or small tools instead of expensive equipment. Nothing about his daily routine suggested extraordinary wealth. He never wore designer clothing. He never arrived in luxury vehicles. He never tried to impress anyone with stories about business success. In a culture where people often measured achievement by what they could display, Robert had spent decades mastering the opposite approach. Those who truly knew him understood that he believed money should create freedom, not attention. It was a philosophy he had developed long before Emily was born, and it shaped every major decision he ever made. Years earlier, Robert had started his career working long hours at a small manufacturing company in the Midwest. He wasn't born into wealth, and no inheritance had opened doors for him. Former colleagues would later remember him as the employee who volunteered for extra shifts, stayed late to understand how every department operated, and spent evenings studying financial reports that most people ignored. While others focused on earning larger paychecks, Robert became fascinated by ownership. He believed that if he could understand how businesses grew over time, patience would eventually reward him far more than salary alone. He saved aggressively, invested cautiously, and refused to chase trends that promised quick riches. Instead, he searched for stable companies with dependable leadership and long-term potential. There were years when those investments seemed painfully slow, and friends questioned whether his strategy made any sense. Robert never argued. He simply continued following the plan he trusted. Over several decades, those modest investments multiplied beyond anything even he had imagined, especially after several regional companies expanded nationally through mergers and acquisitions. What appeared to outsiders as ordinary retirement income was, in reality, only a tiny fraction of the wealth quietly growing in investment accounts very few people even knew existed. Despite his financial success, Robert remained deeply protective of Emily's upbringing. He wanted his daughter to understand the value of work before she ever understood the value of money. She mowed lawns during summer vacations, worked part-time while attending college, and paid many of her own expenses even though Robert could have covered every bill without hesitation. Whenever she questioned why he insisted on teaching such difficult lessons, he smiled and told her that character was easier to build before comfort became permanent. Emily occasionally wondered whether her father worried too much about money because he lived so carefully. She had no idea he was quietly donating significant amounts to scholarship programs, veterans organizations, medical research foundations, and local food banks every year. Many of those donations were made anonymously because Robert believed generosity lost something important when recognition became the goal. Financial records examined after his passing would eventually reveal that he had helped hundreds of families without ever allowing them to know his name. Even Emily was surprised by the number of lives her father had quietly changed while expecting nothing in return. As the years passed, Robert also became increasingly observant of David. He never interfered in his daughter's marriage, nor did he openly criticize the choices they made together. Instead, he watched. During family gatherings, he noticed that David rarely asked Emily about her work unless other people were listening. He noticed that conversations often returned to David's accomplishments, his clients, his promotions, and his ambitions. When Emily expressed excitement about helping students secure funding for new classrooms, David usually responded with polite acknowledgement before shifting attention elsewhere. These moments seemed insignificant on their own, but Robert believed patterns mattered far more than isolated incidents. Character, he often said to an old friend, revealed itself through ordinary habits repeated over many years. That quiet observation became even more important after Robert received unexpected medical news. Several months before anyone else knew something was wrong, Robert sat alone inside a specialist's office listening as doctors explained the results of a series of tests. The diagnosis carried no guarantees. Treatments were available, but time had suddenly become uncertain. Robert drove home that afternoon without calling anyone. He parked his truck in the driveway, walked through the familiar rooms of his home, and spent hours reflecting on the life he had built. He wasn't frightened by the possibility of death nearly as much as he was concerned about what would happen after he was gone. Emily had always trusted people easily because she believed honesty was natural. Robert admired that kindness, but he also understood that not everyone deserved it. For the first time, he began asking himself a question that refused to leave his mind. If his daughter ever faced the greatest challenge of her life, would David protect her, or would he protect himself first? Robert hoped he would never learn the answer, yet something deep inside told him that before long, the truth would reveal itself in a way no conversation ever could. That realization changed everything. Instead of simply updating his estate documents, Robert began working quietly with one of the most respected estate attorneys in the country. Meetings were scheduled discreetly. Financial records were reorganized with extraordinary precision. Trust structures were reviewed, revised, and strengthened to ensure every instruction would be legally enforceable. Nothing was left to chance. Every asset, every investment, every company interest, and every charitable commitment was documented with remarkable detail. To anyone looking from the outside, Robert appeared to be living exactly as he always had. He still drove the same pickup truck, still shopped at the same grocery store, and still spent Saturday mornings repairing furniture in his garage. But while the world believed nothing had changed, Robert was quietly putting the final pieces of a plan into place. It was a plan designed not only to distribute his fortune, but to reveal the true character of the people he would leave behind. And although David had no idea those meetings were taking place, his future was already being shaped by decisions made in rooms he would never enter. By the time Robert's funeral came to an end, David had already made up his mind. The decision hadn't been born in a single afternoon or after one heated argument. It had been developing quietly over many months, hidden beneath ordinary routines and carefully chosen words. While Emily spent her days driving back and forth to the hospital during Robert's final weeks, David had been spending more and more evenings claiming he was entertaining clients or attending networking events. Emily believed him because trust had become second nature after more than a decade of marriage. She never searched through his phone. She never questioned late-night meetings. She never imagined that while she was helping her father through the hardest days of his life, the man she loved was already building another relationship in secret. Friends who later pieced together the timeline would realize the affair had begun months before Robert passed away. David had simply become skilled at living two completely different lives without allowing either one to collide with the other. The woman David had fallen in love with was named Lauren. They first met at a corporate leadership conference where David had been invited to speak on supply chain management. Lauren worked as a marketing executive for a fast-growing technology company, and she possessed the confidence and ambition David admired. Their first conversation centered on business, travel, and career goals. Soon they extended beyond conference halls into private dinners, frequent text messages, and weekend trips disguised as work obligations. David convinced himself that what he felt was genuine love rather than excitement fueled by secrecy. He began comparing Lauren's adventurous personality with Emily's quieter nature, ignoring the fact that Emily had spent years supporting his business while balancing her own demanding career. Instead of appreciating the stability his wife had brought into his life, David started seeing it as routine. The marriage that had once given him comfort now felt ordinary, and he mistook that ordinary comfort for unhappiness. It was a decision countless people have later admitted they regretted only after the consequences became impossible to reverse. Lauren knew David was married when they met. According to messages later examined during legal proceedings, David repeatedly assured her that the marriage had already ended emotionally and that divorce was only a matter of timing. He described himself as trapped in a relationship that no longer fulfilled him. He portrayed Emily as someone who had become distant after her father's illness, carefully leaving out the emotional burden she had carried while caring for Robert. Every story David shared painted himself as the misunderstood husband searching for happiness. Lauren accepted his version of events without ever hearing Emily's side. Together they began discussing a future that included buying a larger home, traveling internationally, and combining their successful careers into what they imagined would become an extraordinary life. David spoke confidently about his financial future. His consulting business continued generating healthy profits, and he believed his income would only increase after the divorce. As far as he was concerned, he was walking away from one chapter and stepping into a better one. The thought that he might be leaving behind something infinitely greater never crossed his mind. Emily remained unaware until the evening David finally asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes, yet every sentence would remain permanently etched into her memory. David avoided eye contact as he explained that he wanted to move on. He admitted there was someone else. He insisted the relationship had simply run its course. He apologized for causing pain but said delaying the inevitable would only make things worse. Emily struggled to process his words. Only weeks earlier they had stood together beside Robert's gravesite holding hands as family members offered condolences. She remembered David placing an arm around her shoulders while promising they would get through the loss together. Now those promises felt painfully hollow. She asked whether counseling could help. David quietly shook his head. She asked whether there was anything she could have done differently. Again he answered no. His mind had already left the marriage long before the conversation ever began. By the end of the evening, he packed a suitcase, collected several personal belongings, and walked out the front door. Emily remained seated at the kitchen table long after the headlights disappeared from the driveway, unable to understand how her world had changed so completely in such a short time. In the weeks that followed, David seemed almost eager to begin his new life. Friends noticed photographs appearing online that showed him attending upscale restaurants, weekend resorts, and exclusive social events with Lauren. Although he avoided publicly announcing the relationship immediately, the truth gradually spread through mutual friends and business associates. Some quietly distanced themselves. Others congratulated him, believing they were witnessing a fresh start rather than the painful collapse of a family. Emily, meanwhile, withdrew from public life almost entirely. She focused on settling Robert's estate, answering endless paperwork, and adjusting to an empty home that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every room carried memories of two different losses, one she expected eventually, and one she never imagined. She cried privately, refusing to speak negatively about David even when friends urged her to expose everything they believed he had done wrong. She simply told people that some questions would eventually answer themselves. What David could not possibly know was that while he celebrated the freedom he believed he had gained, Robert's attorney was quietly preparing to carry out instructions that had been written months before Robert's passing. Every legal document had been reviewed repeatedly to ensure there would be no confusion, no loopholes, and no opportunity for anyone to challenge Robert's intentions. The first stage required patience. Certain notices had to be filed. Waiting periods had to expire. Financial institutions needed time to verify ownership records that stretched across multiple states and several privately held companies. Robert had anticipated every delay and built them into his plan. To David, those weeks felt like the beginning of an exciting new chapter. To the attorney holding Robert's final instructions, they were simply the countdown to a moment that would alter David's future forever. The knock on his door promised in the weeks ahead was drawing closer with every passing day, and the document waiting inside the lawyer's briefcase contained truths that no amount of money, confidence, or regret would ever be able to erase. Nearly 6 weeks after Robert's funeral, Emily received a phone call from the law firm that had handled her father's affairs for more than 20 years. The receptionist spoke with quiet professionalism, asking if she could come to the office the following Tuesday morning. There was no urgency in her voice, but there was a level of formality that immediately caught Emily's attention. She assumed the meeting would involve routine paperwork, perhaps transferring ownership of Robert's home, closing investment accounts she knew little about, or finalizing charitable donations he had mentioned years earlier. She thanked the receptionist, wrote down the appointment time, and spent the next several days gathering the documents she believed the attorney might need. The thought of a hidden fortune never entered her mind. As far as Emily was concerned, her father had lived comfortably, saved responsibly, and left behind enough to cover his modest estate. She expected the meeting to be emotional because it represented another painful reminder that Robert was gone. She did not expect it to become the moment that would redefine everything she believed she knew about her father. The law office occupied the upper floors of a historic downtown building that overlooked the city's financial district. Robert had used the same firm for decades, though Emily had visited only once before while helping him sign routine healthcare documents several years earlier. This time, she noticed details she had overlooked in the past. The reception area displayed awards recognizing the firm's work in estate planning and corporate law. Framed photographs showed generations of attorneys who had practiced there. Shelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes lined the conference room walls. It was a place built on discretion rather than spectacle. When the senior attorney entered the room, he greeted Emily warmly before expressing his condolences once again. His name was Michael Carter, and although he had known Robert professionally for many years, his respect for the older man clearly extended beyond business. There was genuine sadness in his expression as he spoke about Robert's integrity, patience, and remarkable discipline. Emily thanked him politely, assuming those comments were simply kind words offered after a client's passing. She had no idea they were about to take on an entirely different meaning. Michael opened a thick leather portfolio containing several organized folders, each marked with colored tabs and detailed notes. Before discussing numbers or legal documents, he reached for a sealed envelope with Emily's name written neatly across the front in Robert's familiar handwriting. He explained that Robert had instructed him to deliver the letter personally before any other matters were discussed. Emily hesitated for a moment before opening it. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the pages. The first lines brought tears almost immediately. My dear Emily, if you are reading this, then I am no longer able to tell you these things myself. That is perhaps my greatest disappointment because being your father has always been the greatest privilege of my life. I know your heart, and I know you are grieving. If recent events have left you feeling abandoned, I need you to remember something I told you when you were a little girl. A person's true character rarely appears during easy seasons. It reveals itself when loyalty becomes inconvenient. Emily paused, unable to continue for several seconds. Michael quietly waited while she gathered herself. The words sounded exactly like Robert. Calm. Thoughtful. Never dramatic, yet somehow deeply comforting. She wiped away tears and continued reading. You may soon discover that I have kept certain parts of my financial life private. I did this for reasons that had nothing to do with secrecy and everything to do with protecting you. Money changes how people see one another. I wanted anyone who entered your life to value you for your kindness, your honesty, and your strength, not for what they imagined they might gain. If someone remained beside you through ordinary days, I could trust their intentions far more than if wealth had always been visible. Emily lowered the letter once more, overwhelmed by emotions she struggled to describe. Suddenly, dozens of childhood memories made sense. The old pickup truck. The modest home. The insistence that she work for everything she earned. Robert had never been pretending to be poor. He had simply refused to let wealth define him. Michael gently cleared his throat before opening another folder. Emily, he said softly, your father spent many years preparing for this meeting. He instructed me to explain everything carefully because he expected the information to be difficult to believe. He began reviewing financial statements, ownership certificates, trust agreements, and valuation reports prepared by independent accounting firms. At first, the figures seemed impossible to process. Emily assumed she had misunderstood the commas or decimal places. Michael patiently explained each document one at a time. Robert had accumulated significant ownership interests in manufacturing companies, transportation firms, commercial real estate partnerships, and long-term investment portfolios. Many of those holdings had appreciated dramatically over several decades. Combined with carefully managed trusts and other assets, the estimated value of Robert's estate exceeded $400 million. The room fell completely silent. Emily stared at the documents spread across the conference table without speaking. She searched her memory for any conversation that might explain what she was seeing, but there had been none. The father who repaired his own fence, clipped coupons, and wore the same winter coat for years had quietly built a fortune that placed him among the wealthiest private investors in the region. Yet almost no one knew. Finally, Emily looked up. There has to be some mistake. Michael slowly shook his head. There isn't. He slid another document across the table. Your father reviewed these valuations repeatedly over the last several years. He wanted absolute certainty before making any final decisions. Emily took a slow breath, still struggling to understand the scale of what she had just heard. But before she could ask another question, Michael reached for one final folder that had remained closed since the meeting began. Its cover carried a single handwritten instruction from Robert. Open only after Emily has learned the full value of the estate. Michael rested his hand on the folder for a moment before looking directly at Emily. Everything we've discussed so far, he said quietly, is only the beginning. Your father left very specific instructions concerning David. Emily's eyes widened. For the first time that morning, Robert's careful planning no longer felt like ordinary estate preparation. It felt like he had been expecting this moment all along. Emily could feel her heartbeat echoing in the quiet conference room as Michael slowly opened the final folder. Unlike the other documents, which contained financial statements, investment summaries, and trust agreements, this file was almost entirely handwritten. Every page carried Robert's careful signature in the lower corner, along with dates showing they had been prepared months before his health began to decline. Michael glanced at the first page before looking back at Emily. Your father anticipated that this section would raise many questions, he said. He instructed me to read certain portions exactly as he wrote them. Emily nodded without speaking. Michael began reading. If David is still faithfully married to my daughter at the time these instructions are carried out, I ask that he receive the same respect and welcome into our family legacy that I always hoped he would earn. If, however, he has voluntarily abandoned his marriage to Emily, or entered another relationship before or immediately after ending that marriage, then the following provisions are to be enforced exactly as written. Emily closed her eyes. The words felt almost impossible to hear. Robert had never spoken harshly about David. In fact, he had defended him more than once whenever relatives questioned his priorities. Yet here, in black ink written months before his death, Robert had clearly imagined that something like this might happen. Michael continued. These instructions are not written from anger. They are written from observation. Wealth has the power to expose intentions that ordinary life keeps hidden. I have spent years watching how people treat my daughter when they believe there is nothing to gain. That knowledge is worth more than any financial report I have ever reviewed. Emily wiped another tear from her face. She suddenly remembered a conversation with her father nearly 2 years earlier. They had been sitting on the porch after dinner when Robert casually asked whether she was happy. At the time, the question had seemed ordinary. She had smiled and answered yes without hesitation. Robert had smiled back, but before changing the subject, he quietly added, "Always remember that the people who remain beside you when life becomes difficult are showing you who they really are." She had thought he was simply offering fatherly advice. Now she wondered whether he had already begun noticing things she had completely missed. Michael placed Robert's handwritten pages aside and opened another document. "This next section," he explained, "contains legally binding instructions rather than personal reflections." The first clause was straightforward. Emily would inherit the overwhelming majority of Robert's estate through a carefully structured trust designed to protect both the assets and her privacy. Several charitable foundations would continue receiving annual funding exactly as Robert had arranged during his lifetime. Longtime employees of companies Robert privately owned would receive generous bonuses, and several scholarship programs would become permanent endowments. Then came the clause that caused Michael to pause. He looked directly at Emily before continuing. "Your father instructed that a formal legal notice be delivered personally to David exactly 6 weeks after his funeral, provided the conditions outlined in these documents had been satisfied." Emily frowned. "A legal notice?" Michael nodded. "Yes. What does it say?" Michael removed another sealed envelope. "This is addressed to David." Emily stared at it silently. "I have not opened it," Michael explained. "Your father instructed that it remain sealed until the moment it is delivered." The room grew quiet once again. After several seconds, Emily finally spoke. "Why 6 weeks?" Michael gave a faint smile. "Because your father believed 6 weeks would be enough time." "Enough time for what?" "For David to make permanent decisions without knowing anything about the estate." Emily slowly leaned back in her chair. Every detail had been calculated. Robert hadn't wanted David making choices based on money. He wanted those choices to reveal something much deeper. Michael then explained that Robert had insisted the timing be precise. If David chose to rebuild his marriage before the 6-week period expired, certain provisions could change. If he remained committed to ending the marriage and moving forward with another life, then the original instructions would stand exactly as written. Emily's mind raced. David had already filed the divorce paperwork. He had already introduced Lauren publicly. According to mutual friends, they had even begun discussing wedding plans. He believed the hardest part of his life was already behind him. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. Michael closed the folder and folded his hands. "Emily, your father never wanted revenge." She looked up. "He told me many times that revenge satisfies emotions for a moment, but wisdom protects people for a lifetime." "Then why all of this?" Michael answered without hesitation. "Because he wanted truth to arrive before wealth did." Those words lingered in the room. For the first time since Robert's funeral, Emily understood that her father had not spent his final months trying to control people's lives. He had simply refused to let $400 million become the reason someone chose to remain in his daughter's life. The inheritance was never meant to test character. The absence of it had already done that. Michael stood and carefully placed the sealed envelope into a leather document case. "I'll be leaving for David's office first thing tomorrow morning." Emily looked at the case. "What happens after he reads it?" Michael paused before answering. "I practiced estate law for over 35 years. He looked toward the window overlooking the city skyline. "I've delivered difficult news to families, business partners, and corporate executives. I've watched people celebrate inheritances and I've watched others lose fortunes overnight." Then he looked back at Emily. "But I have never delivered a letter quite like the one your father asked me to place into David's hands." Neither of them realized that at that exact moment, several miles away, David and Lauren were celebrating what they believed was the beginning of the happiest chapter of their lives. They were laughing over dinner, discussing honeymoon destinations, looking at luxury homes online, and talking excitedly about the future. Less than 24 hours later, there would be a knock at David's office door. It would be the same knock teased from the very beginning of this story. And once David broke the seal on Robert's final letter, he would discover that the quiet father-in-law he had barely acknowledged at family dinners had understood him far better than he had ever imagined.